This week on Act Out, a look at the understory of the Amazon fires and the long history of colonialist destruction. If we want to protect the forest, we've got to protect the people. And look to them for solutions that exist outside the confines of a system that continues to wreak havoc on all living things. Next, Ann Peterman from Global Justice Ecology Project sits down with us for some straight talk on the #happy reforestation trend, fall solutions, and important upcoming actions. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. The Amazon is burning, and at this point, that really shouldn't be news to anyone. But as corporate media sensationalizes a shallow story and bullshit like "pray for Amazonia" goes viral, there's a bigger and deeper story that needs to be heard. A story that sheds light on real versus false solutions. But first, some backstory. The most recent fires are entirely man-made, and last week's significant surge in fires occurred after August 10th's so-called Day of Fire, where farmers, emboldened by President Bolsonaro's homicidal, profit-driven schemes, sought to open up more land for crop fields and cattle ranches. This tactic of burning rainforest for big ag and mining operations is sadly nothing new. Indeed, while the fires this year are up 84% since the same time last year, the National Institute for Space Research has recorded more than 74,000 so far. In 2016, 2.5 years before Bolsonaro came to power, INPE recorded some 68,484 fires. Now, this is not to say that Bolsonaro doesn't deserve a shit heap of blame, but rather to point out that burning the lungs of our planet is not a new phenomenon. It's just kind of new to have trending hashtags about it. Indeed, between the 1990s and 2010, deforestation of global tropical forests, including the Amazon, rose by 62%. Then, between 2004 and 2011, deforestation in the Amazon alone decreased by 77% thanks to strict monitoring and legislation. But deforestation began to soar again under President Dilma Rousseff, who wanted to take advantage of the global economic recovery by opening up more of the Amazon to business, including dam projects, big ag, and mining. In the past 3 decades altogether, the Amazon has lost about 1/5 of its forest cover, and with it, the biodiversity and, of course, carbon capture capabilities. To give you a little idea of the importance of the Amazon as a global heat sink, the Amazon represents roughly 1/4 of all the carbon dioxide that's absorbed by forests every year. 1/4. One rainforest. Granted, it spans 9 countries, although nearly 2/3 of it lie within Brazil, and it's still roughly 24 times the size of the UK, but now, with 3 football fields burning every minute, that reach and vitality is at the highest level of risk at a time in which our planet is the warmest it's been in human history. Meanwhile, outside of the vital heat trapping that the Amazon provides, it is the most biodiverse region in the entire world, with more species per square kilometer than in the whole of Europe. One example, in just 1 hectare, about the size of a sports field, researchers were able to identify more than 450 tree species. In all of Germany, there aren't even 100. Beyond that, there are tens of thousands of plant species, including countless medicinal plants, over 2.5 million insect species, 1,300 kinds of birds, 430 mammals, over 3,000 fish species, and hundreds of different amphibians and reptiles. And that's an underestimation. Many species are still totally unknown to us. New species are discovered every year. And yet, ironically, this powerhouse of biodiversity has some of the least fertile soil in the world. Almost all of its biomass is above ground. So as land is burned and cleared for cattle farming, mining, and big ag, it is irrevocably destroyed. Sure, you could plant some fucking soybeans there for a year or 2, but then you have to move on. Burn or cut down more rainforest because the soil there is spent. So even from an economical standpoint, this gross deforestation is totally pointless. Still, that hasn't stopped any number of administrations from condemning the whole forest and, of course, its inhabitants to death. A recently leaked presentation shows that Bolsonaro and his administration didn't just want to get rid of the Amazon, they wanted to make sure to preemptively crush any legitimate conservation efforts. The Bolsonaro government has, as one of its priorities, to strategically occupy the Amazon region to prevent the implementation of multilateral conservation projects for the rainforest, specifically the so-called AAA project. The AAA project, the Andes, Amazon, and Atlanta project, is a conservation effort led by the organization Gaia Amazonas, which aims to conserve 265 million square kilometers of jungle and the lungs of our world. The project highlights in particular the importance of indigenous culture in this preservation, a further affront to the fascist anti-indigenous rhetoric of Bolsonaro. And herein lies a cornerstone of the destruction and potential preservation. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been in the crosshairs of Bolsonaro's administration since he took office, because somewhere he knows that there is power in their knowledge. There's power in their voice. But here again, this story is not new. As we've covered on the show many times before, colonialism never ended, it just found new tools. In a recent in-depth article in The Intercept, Alexander Zaitchik writes, "In the rainforest bastion state of Amazonas, indigenous lands account for close to a third of the standing forest. The indigenous groups of the region have seen this all before. During the runaway deforestation of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they witnessed and were devastated by a, quote, arc of fire that blazed along the routes of the first penetration roads into the western Amazon. By the late 1980s, a burning crescent swept down from the northern Amazonian city of Belém through the states of Pará, Mato Grosso, Rondônia, and Acre. It burned brightest in Rondônia, where the smoke and ash from hundreds of raging fires were visible to the naked eyes of astronauts in high orbit. By the time the new constitution was adopted in 1988, Brazil's indigenous population dropped from estimates of the low millions at the start of the century to around 200,000. Thanks to decades of the aforementioned deforestation, be it under fascist President Vargas's 1930s call to march to the west and settle the Amazon, or the more recent neoliberal sheen of 21st century progress. However, as deforestation abated, indigenous populations rose. And with a deep generational understanding of colonial violence, indigenous tribes are realistic and resolute about the future of their home, and indeed all of humanity. Marcelino da Silva, a member of the Apurinha tribe, said, "We know what happens when the state does nothing. We know how quickly the forest can disappear." An Apurinha Assembly letter to the FUNAI, the federal Indian agency, as well as the federal public ministry, reads, "We ask the government to value our past and our deep connections to this land. The deforestation is advancing towards us. Our territory must be guaranteed for our children, according to our rights in the federal constitution. If the government doesn't do it, we'll do it ourselves." Fabiana Apurinha, also a member of the Apurinha tribe, echoed this sentiment boldly, stating, "We are doing what we can, organizing, monitoring, and petitioning. We are warriors and will mobilize to defend ourselves and the forest. But we need help." In short, helping the people of the Amazon means helping the Amazon. These tribes understand deeply the connections that exist in their homelands. They understand and respect the fragility as well as the power that the forest holds. And if we want to save what's left of this vital ecosystem, we have to follow their lead, the lead of those who understand this place the most. We have to sidestep mindless donations to big NGOs who don't understand or really care about the necessary systemic shifts or the frontline communities most affected. We have to highlight the fact that while we're engaging with the charity industrial complex, our governments spend billions on beef, soy, timber, minerals, and other products that come from the Amazon. that our tax dollars subsidize corporations that engage in this destruction. Like in May, when reports came out that some $60 million in subsidies earmarked for struggling US farmers was actually going to Brazilian pork company JBS. And yeah, this means that you should personally eat less pork, or just stop altogether. But that's not the main point. As I've noted before on the show, the idea that these kind of personal choices can save the world or save millions of acres of rainforest is absurd at best. In a recent op-ed for The Guardian, Brazilian socialist politician and husband of journalist Glenn Greenwald, David Miranda writes, "In lieu of unilateral decrees that smack of arrogant colonialism, rich industrialized countries who need the Amazon to survive should fund social programs for poor Brazilians who compose a large majority of our supremely unequal country, in exchange for preservation of this vital environmental asset." Absolutely. A just transition that takes the economic force of destroying rainforests and turns it into something that protects the rainforests, that protects the people, something that places economic and political force on Brazil and other Amazonian nations to respect indigenous peoples and bolster their preservation of this vital ecosystem. A global day of action on September 5th has been announced by Extinction Rebellion along with Amazon Watch to Act for Amazonia, an answer to the passive Pray for Amazonia that went viral last week. Folks can learn more and support via Amazon Watch. Gaia Amazonas, the organization highlighted in the leaked presentation, is another good resource, and Rainforest Alliance as well. Links to these organizations will be included in the show notes. But let me just be clear, capitalism cannot solve this crisis. Money flowing to the right places rather than subsidizing destruction is a vital stopgap measure to stem the current destruction and shift focus. But it can't do everything. The mayhem that this global economic system has wrought cannot be undone by that same system. As we move to act, and I do mean act, not just sign a petition, as we move to act for the Amazon within the confines of our system, because that's where we must act now, we have to simultaneously look ahead to systemic change that will pedestal the rights and visions of the guardians of this ecosystem. We have to listen to their needs, prioritize them. We have to place sustainability and a livable future above ones and zeros on a Wall Street screen. And yeah, that's a totally tall order, but that's reality. And we stand at those crossroads, those of you watching in the US, as children of an empire pushing hard on that homicidal gas pedal. So much lies in our hands, in our feet. And that's heavy. But that's also a hell of an opportunity. Hope lies in the roots, the ground, and in the tree crowns. Moving on, but staying very much in the forest's embrace, we sit down with Ann Peterman, Executive Director of Global Justice Ecology Project, to discuss the problem with the #happy reforestation and plant a tree movement, the true scope of how important our remaining forests are, and what we need to know about the pitfalls and false solutions crowding our media streams. Take a look.
Forests have been a really crucial component of both the climate justice issue and the climate change issue from many different perspectives. So climate change has been driven largely by, has been accelerated, let's say it that way, by deforestation, especially over the last 50 years, the massive deforestation that's happened globally. There's about, 2 billion or so hectares of forest that's been lost in the last 50 years. So that obviously has an impact on climate. And it's also forests are being pushed as a solution to climate change, which is having all kinds of impacts on the people who have historically preserved those forests. So, for example, polluting industries are trying to use forests as an excuse to keep on polluting through projects like the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Scheme, known as REDD, which is a UN project. So companies can, for example, purchase or buy the offsets from forests in the global south, like in Chiapas, Mexico, but in order to supposedly protect that carbon in the forests, the people who live there have to go because they might use a tree, So it causes tremendous climate injustice, both on that end and on the other end of the communities that are around the refineries and other polluting industries that are buying the right to keep on polluting. So that's a major issue. Then there's also the issue of trees. Well, let's say that there's been a new proposal that came out, I think it was either last week or the week before. It's being called the Trillion Tree Proposal. This study group came up with this research that said if we planted 1 trillion trees, we would be able to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere and put a halt to climate change. It's ridiculous on many levels, but what's dangerous about it is everyone thinks this is a really easy solution. Oh, great. All we have to do is plant trees and we'll stop climate change, which, of course, does nothing to address the fact that we're still putting out all of these carbon emissions. And in addition to that, because that particular study uses the UN Food and Agriculture Organization definition of forests, they're not even talking about forests. The UN FAO definition of forests says that as long as an area of land has about 10% tree cover, it can be called a forest. It doesn't have to be native. It can be, a eucalyptus plantation in Brazil. It can be genetically engineered. They don't care. As long as there's 10% of trees in a given area, they'll call it a forest. So there's no way to assure that this trillion tree proposal would actually be about restoring forests as much as it would be about putting more trees into the ground of any kind. That then, of course, connects to other false solutions to climate change, like biomass electricity production, which means, cutting down trees to burn them in what was a coal-fired power plant, or to co-fire it with coal. Either way, it's just as polluting and even more destructive to the environment because you're, causing deforestation or putting in tree plantations often where there used to be forests. In addition, it's encouraging the development of tree plantations like oil palm. Oil palm is going crazy all over the planet. If we could protect the forests that are out there now by ensuring the rights of Indigenous peoples who have historically protected those forests, if we could actually restore forests, have a campaign that goes into degraded forests and helps restore the biodiversity in those forests, that would be great. But that's largely not what's being talked about.
With regards to false solutions, it's very trendy now with this idea of planting a tree. And I want to dive deeper into that with regards to the issue that you mentioned, tree plantations and this sort of like monoculture of trees, but also why just going out and planting trees doesn't address the larger ecosystems that are destroyed by deforestation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one of the problems with this whole tree planting thing is that, as you mentioned, it's not addressing the deforestation that is not only ongoing, but actually escalating. So there are potentials for restoring forests where they've been degraded, but that doesn't replace the fact that we have to keep the forests standing that are currently standing on the planet. The other problem is when you cut a forest, it releases enormous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere from the soils, not to mention whatever's being done with the wood. And you can't make up for that by planting new trees. The carbon that's lost when you deforest an area, even if you planted the same number of trees in that area, and even if you made it a biodiverse forest, it would still take 30, 50, 70, 100 years before that piece of land is storing the amount of carbon that it was storing before it was deforested.
I mean, obviously it can't be done with this sort of monoculture approach, but is there a way that you see that we can address what we've already destroyed in terms of rewilding or reforesting?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it depends on the ecosystem. Some ecosystems have that ability to regenerate and be rejuvenated. In the eastern forests of the U.S., for example, by the 1850s, I'll just give Vermont as a specific example. By the 1850s, Vermont was 80% deforested. And by the 1990s, it was 80% forested. 20% deforested. So, that these forests just regenerated themselves. And there are other forests that can have that potential as well. And if you help them along by, putting some native species in there, that can certainly, expedite the process. But you still have to wait for these trees to grow. A seedling is not a 100-year-old tree in terms of carbon storage or anything else. So, yeah. So the most important thing is stopping deforestation. Then there's also forest restoration, which in some ecosystems can work. In places like the Amazon or the Indonesian rainforest is not very helpful. And that in those places, the forests just have to be protected.
And in terms of, alternatives, like people talk about, planting hemp in order to get like paper products and things like that. Do you see that as sort of a useful transition to keep forests where they are and instead plant kind of like crops that can be used for products that we currently use trees for?
The issue with any of the alternatives to the alternatives to trees for producing paper or the other wood products is the problem that it's still on an industrial scale. So you're still at the current demand for paper products or other wood products. It's not sustainable no matter what you use. So the first thing that has to happen, and this is what Global Justice Ecology Project talks about a lot, is demand reduction. We have to stop our overconsumption levels and actually pull back the consumption levels about 90%, of energy, of wood products, across the board. And I'm talking about the global elite countries in the north predominantly. And some places in the south, there are elites like in Brazil and South Africa that are also guilty of this. But until that happens, until that 90% is decreased in energy consumption, wood consumption, and so on, there isn't going to be a sustainable alternative.
So with regards to actual solutions as opposed to false solutions, how do you see, for instance, with regards to slashing our demand, how do you see us getting from, point A to point B?
There have been some studies recently that have shown that the majority of emissions are actually being produced by a very small number of companies, 100 or so companies producing something like 70% of the emissions. So, there's a great place to start.
What do you feel are some ways to address this, and how does like that focus on forests play into that?
For myself personally, I am an anti-authoritarian, and Global Justice Ecology Project is not a lobbying organization. We're not a political policy organization. We are an organization that believes in no compromise. As far as what will get us from here to there, I think it has to be that kind of no compromise attitude from at least a sector of the movement. Historically, that sector is the one that has pushed the envelope further toward what you actually want. So there's always people in the middle willing to make the compromises and willing to say, well, let's be moderate, let's be realistic, but there has to be the dreamers and the visionaries and the utopians on the other side, the radicals, saying, no, this is what we want. We will settle for nothing less. And direct action certainly has to be a part of that. Real direct action. I'm not talking about symbolic, let's hold a banner direct action, but let's actually shut it down. Direct action has got to be a piece of this as well.
And so in terms of the forest, because I think a lot of people think when they think about trying to stop climate chaos, they think about targeting, oil pipelines and things like, which is of course incredibly important. But what do you feel is a good way to step into the specific issue of protecting and defending forests?
That's a really good question. It's a hard one because the forests are, they're all over the place, and all of these forests are threatened. So it's not just like at one time, in the 80s, it was let's save the Amazon, and people were putting all of their energy into saving the Amazon. Now the forests are threatened pretty much everywhere. So it really has to be communities coming together to make the decision to protect the forests in their own communities, which gets, has a lot of issues in itself because people rely on the forest for their jobs and so forth and so on. And that's where you get into some of the just transition ideas. Let's make sure that people can not have a job working for somebody else, but let's figure out how people in communities can support each other, have livelihoods that support the community, that are controlled by the community, that are for the well-being of the community and not for some, bigwig that's living in another city. It's not an easy one, but it's a critical one, and it's one that each community is going to have to figure out for itself.
So finally, do you want to mention anything about the convergence in October?
Sure. Yeah. Anybody who wants to dive into these issues of forests and climate in a deeper way and start looking for some of these real solutions and really finding the actual root causes of these problems, not just putting Band-Aids on them, not looking to politicians to solve the problem for us, but addressing them ourselves and figuring out what we can do as unified movements. People should check out the website. It's forestclimateconvergence.org. And on that, you can find out ways to get involved. You can see our call to action, our guiding principles. They're all very radical, and they're all against false solutions and about finding the root causes and identifying the real culprits and creating campaigns that can actually make a difference. We don't have many years left to figure this out, and this convergence recognizes that and wants to bring people together to figure out what those solutions are.
To see and hear the full interview with Anne, which I definitely recommend, check out our social media pages and our podcast, which airs every Friday on Libsyn, Stitcher, Spotify, and iTunes. For more on Anne's work, visit globaljusticeecology.org, and for more information about the forest and climate movement convergence, visit forestclimateconvergence.org. As Anne notes in our interview, this convergence is for people who are committed to be a part of the movement for change, because we can't just rely on people who are already activists. So check it out, sign up, and act out, as it were. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Before you click off, sign up for the Act Out newsletter because it is the best way to stay up to date on all of our stories. For those of you who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word to help ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out.
And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not